In order to analyze racism in Guyana and identify its impact in society, we must first understand racism and its various dimensions. Now, what is racism? Well, the Oxford Dictionary defines racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now, there are multiple dimensions of racism. These are attitudinal racism, ideological racism, group racism, and institutional racism. Attitudinal racism refers to the discrimination of a group of people without proper justification. This, in respect to Guyanese, was due to inherited resentment that has been passed down from generations through family teachings of hostility towards specific groups of people by emphasizing past conflicts and hardships that was inflicted upon them by that group. Ideological racism relates to one's belief that a race is superior to other races. The last and arguably the most lethal form of racism prevalent in Guyana is institutional racism. This occurs when a sovereign state incorporates prejudice against a certain race within their judicial system, which encourages inequality. Now we will examine the historical background of racism within Guyana. Racism in Guyana was evident or developed from the system of slavery and indentureship. Slavery and indentureship are two intertwined terms that are synonymous with the roots of racial ideology within Guyana. This connection takes the structure of the plantation society and the exploitative nature of the Europeans into account. Firstly, in the case of the structure of the plantation society, the whites were in the minority. There was a pyramid-shaped population ratio in which the majority comprised of the slaves and laborers. The whites were indeed at the peak of the pyramid, therefore denoting supreme power, but disadvantaged in the case of numbers. This issue would have gotten worse with the arrival of the East Indian laborers in 1863. The workers were now in majority. If allowed, they could have easily overpowered their masters. This is where the exploitative nature is taken into consideration. The European masters were able to turn the two parties against each other to remain in absolute control. This led to the lasting rivalry on the plantation that perpetuated throughout the ages. Guyana has experienced extensive periods of violent racial conflicts that has continued to strengthen the ethnic segregation. The fires of division were fueled by a socialist leader, Lyndon Forbes Barnum, who encouraged social separation in order to gain political advantage against the opposition leader, Cherry Jagan. Following years of ethnic violence, Barnum seized power through voting fraud and exercised his socialist power to ensure he maintained absolute control. Barnum benefited from the change from the system of plurality to proportional representation and exploited a flawed electoral system to ensure he regained his power each election. Therefore, Barnum not only facilitated and incubated years of racial superiority and violence, but also prevented the East Indians from exercising their political franchise. This deprivation of fundamental human rights and needs buried in the hearts of each East Indian the hatred towards Barnum and the African race. The East Indians and their political party will eventually re-establish control, which enabled them to exact revenge on their ethnic rivals, which led to a cultural war that will never cease to exist. From the Barnum era to the present, institutional racism has played a vital role in Guyana's social cognitive culture, as seen in the following videos.
Guyana has a bitter past. Nearly 200 people died in a violent struggle between the parties before independence. There are two main racial groups. Guyanese of African origin are concentrated in the towns and dominate the police, army and civil service. Most of them will vote for the existing, largely Negro government. But the majority of Guyanese are of Indian origin. Their ancestors were shipped from India to labor in the sugar fields. They're likely to vote massively for the opposition and its Indian Marxist leader. To win, the government needs every vote it can lay its hands on, and it's taking no chances. 1,000 troops patrolled the plantations when Indian sugar workers went on strike last month. All the old bitterness between Indian and Negro, between left and right, still simmers.
This former British colony is racked by economic insecurity. And as the uncertainty increases, impoverished Guyanese are turning on each other. Killings that they call street justice. In Guyana, ethnic divisions are visible at all levels: political allegiances, employment, and where people have settled. This is a divided land. I headed to Annandale, an almost exclusively Indian township a few miles outside the capital, Georgetown. It's really when you start heading out of the capital into the rural areas that you start seeing real signs of segregation. There are whole villages here that are occupied either solely by Africans or Indians. Ethnic tensions and gang violence have led to over 200 murders in the last year. With a population of just over 700,000, bloodshed has become commonplace. You don't have to wait long to get news of another killing.
For this is a nation where racial background has, for decades, largely determined how everyone votes. We went to 2 political rallies on the eve of this election. This one was held by the governing party, the PPP. The president, Donald Ramotar, who has a Marxist background, is addressing the crowd. Look at the faces of those listening to him. Almost everyone here is Indo-Guyanese, descendants of workers originally from India and Guyana's largest ethnic group. By contrast, the opposition rally across town was packed out with Afro-Guyanese supporters. The opposition leader, David Granger, believes that after 23 years of Indian-dominated government, he's formed a coalition that will make him president.
We believe that the racial division is becoming a thing of the past, but the racial tension is evident in various dimensions of Guyanese passive lifestyle. I believe that this racial tension only lies dormant until sparked by political outrage which the opposition party seeks to refuel in order to regain the political advantage. The only way we can generate a truly integrated society is to break away the cultural mindset of preferential suffering, where an individual prefers in a social crisis for their respective race be the group in possession of the monetary and legislative advantage, and to also commence mental reconciliation by breaking cognitive barriers inherited from ancestral hate.